You can make it. Yeah. All right, I'll do it.
Is there room?
Yeah, so it's like my old days in the barbershop quartet. All this champion here. How are y'all doing? Is everyone all right? Thank you all for packing in here on a Wednesday night. I have a 4-month-old at home. I didn't know what day it was for a second. And so I'm in a fog of sleeplessness, but it's a joyous occasion to be here with you all to celebrate Minor Notes, Volume 1, a labor of love that I put together with my friend and colleague, Jesse McCarthy. Jesse and I have known each other 13 years. Is that right? Yeah, we first met at Princeton. I mean, yeah, y'all know how it goes. I looked across the room on, that first day of grad school. I said, oh, that's a brother over there. And then I just went over and spoke to him, and we've been thick as thieves ever since. This book is in one way a product of a certain kind of love that just emerged from a Halloween party in Jamaica Plain, where Jesse came over. It was the first event that my now wife and I, Pam, threw. We were just boyfriend and girlfriend back then. Not just, but literally just, actually. We just started dating 2 weeks before. But we threw a party together to just see how that thing would work out. And Jesse was kind enough to come through to the condo. And we ended up talking about James Sneed, the great Black literary theorist, may he rest, and his book, Figures of Division, which Jesse saw on my bookcase. And he said, man, that's a deep cut. He's almost like a kind of minor theorist in the tradition. And we started thinking, well, who are the other minor theorists, minor poets, minor notes? I kid you not. It was like a biopic. It happened just like that. And since then, we've just been putting together all of these poets that we love, poets whose work we found in used bookstores and on rare eBay booksellers lists. And we came together with this wonderful ensemble that you see in this volume. The second one is coming up, where we just finished getting permissions, which has taken us a little over a year and a half. The second one will focus mostly on young people's literature, so children as young as 4 and 5 years old, and some folks in their early 20s who are edited by people like Langston Hughes, back when he was still at Lincoln. So it's a beautiful collection. We're really excited for you all to see it. Tonight, some of my dearest friends in the world will be up here reading. Some folks from Langston Legacy, Danielle and Patrick, who I'll introduce more at length in a little bit, but everyone who will touch the stage today are folks who've been writing together for quite some time, sometimes in quiet rooms, sometimes over Zoom, and sometimes, thankfully, in person in spaces like this. So, Jesse, I don't have your bio on hand, but what will I say about Jesse McCarthy? Oh my goodness, he's just, he's one of the best uncles in the world. Every single time we've thrown an event for my son, August Galileo, Jesse shows up with a rare book or a smile, which is an even greater gift. He got August his first ever unit of clothing. It's like Nike blue bucket hat, which I talk about every time I do a public event at Jesse, just because it's so fly. And it was like August's first bucket hat, which is it's a big thing, for a young Black boy in America. Your first bucket hat is like a major milestone. And so Jesse helped bring that into the world for him. So he's going to come up, read some poetry, and then we'll get into the night. Thank you all.
How y'all doing? All right. Thank you for coming out. We really appreciate this. We really appreciate you showing love for this incredible institution. I want to give a shout out to Grolier for hosting us. And I thought I'd just, pick up on what Joshua was just saying by saying in turn that one of the things that I'm really proud of about this anthology is that it is a work of collaboration. It really comes out of our friendship, and also I would say, and Joshua already spoke to it at a personal level, but it's also an intellectual collaboration. And I feel about Minor Notes that it reflects in some sense our attempt to think through what we so fondly, I suppose, in the profession, refer to as the tradition. And we think about the place of the past and our relationship to it. And I think one of the things that motivates us is a deep sense of our own place, our own arrival within this tradition as not at all a given, right? That we stand on the shoulders of those who have come before, and that we owe a certain kind of debt there. There's a certain ethic of responsibility that comes with this. To be a poet, to be a Black poet in the United States of America has always been, in some sense, almost at its origin, a kind of contradiction. And we remember, of course, the trial of Phyllis Wheatley, and Jefferson's attitudes towards Wheatley, which I won't repeat here, but which I always think it bears emphasizing that at the root of it was a fundamental denial that Black people could even be poets, right? It was not just a denial of her, but it was a denial of the humanity of Black Americans. And I've always actually thought that there's a certain kind of way in which, as ferocious and terrible and sort of quintessentially racist as that act of denial was, it speaks volumes, I think, that the response of Black Americans has always been from Wheatley, from Jupiter Hammond, from the very beginning, not merely to sort of denounce or defy or disprove that assertion, but as Toni Morrison says, to do language. This is just what we do. We love it. We love poetry. We love language. We love doing language. We love transforming it, changing it, manipulating it, turning it, playing with form, and giving it our own inflections. And I think, we felt that, the tradition of African-American poetry in this country has, its recognition has come a long way since then. And that's something that we can all be immensely proud of, and it's very important. But I think we also felt that there were those authors, those writers who were constantly sort of falling through the cracks, constantly getting overlooked. Now, you could say, well, maybe, they're of lesser importance. But I think as we thought about it, part of what we are interested in is kind of going back to thinking about this question of ethics in poetry. And for us, part of the question that kind of is illuminated by turning our attention deliberately to the quote unquote minor is really to kind of recenter poetry in some sense as a social practice, right? It's not actually just about constituting a pantheon of greatness to compete with other pantheons of greatness, right? It's not just to kind of repeatedly in anthologies show the same 3 poems by the same 3 people to constitute evidence that we can write poetry too, or something like that, right? To actually show the extent to which poetry was loved by so many people, who in many ways were just sort of parts of their community. So many of our writers were simply teachers in their communities, high school teachers, librarians, right? And in some cases, just private citizens. But they all shared a deep love of poetry, a deep love of oratory, a deep love of the word. And to us, this anthology is, in a way, an attempt to kind of argue for and recenter a certain conception of what poetry is, right? And one that's informed by this ethic. I don't want to go on too much longer, except to also say of Joshua's work that part of what I think is reflected in our collaboration on Minor Notes is that his work, like mine, is so, I think, invested in attempting to recommit ourselves to a kind of an embedded social understanding of literature, right? And I think in particular here of your most recent work on the spoken word and the tradition of spoken word poetry, which it's the first book of its kind. And again, very much in the spirit of Minor Notes, is bringing us back to a conception of poetry that's taken away from sort of institutionality. And so I'm very proud of that. And the last thing I should say, because there's always the plug, right, is that there will be a volume 2. And part of what we're really excited about volume 2, and which again reflects kind of the ethic that we bring to this project, is that volume is really concentrated on what we're calling the poetry of young people. We're really interested in actually centering students, high school students, college students, people who are in their, early years as makers of poetry, as readers of poetry, as founders of important, historical schools of poetry. And part of that ethic for us is not just, again, in terms of publication or republication or putting things in books. It's also about, for us, we really wanted these books to have a kind of role to play in pedagogy, to be useful in the classroom, right? So, I mean, maybe you can find some of these poems here and there, but our hope was that in bringing them together in this way, you could teach a course around these poems. And we want to get students interested in not only the poetry of the present, which they're already so interested in, but making those connections between the communities of poetics in the present and those in the past, getting them interested in the archive, being able to see themselves as, connected to that kind of work. And so we're very committed to, kind of doing programming with local schools, trying to find, we just did a wonderful trip to the Boston Athenaeum, bringing students there, and kind of getting them engaged with exploring archives. So I won't go on too much longer. We're here to read and listen to a little bit of poetry. I thought I would read a little bit from a poet who I really, really love, and that is Fenton Johnson. Fenton in many ways has a kind of uh, um, two sides to his career. There was sort of an earlier phase very much at the turn of the century, in which he was a Chicago poet, but was still in some ways felt to be a poet who was tied to what at that time would have been considered almost a kind of Victorian sense of formalism in poetry, and someone who was keen to show that he could master the codes of that kind of writing. But with time, he begins to kind of shift, and he moves into what many have argued is a kind of more modernist phase. His writing takes on, in many ways, he begins to kind of experiment with a kind of prose rhythm, with a more open line. But there's something also very interesting that changes in his tone. There, in the earlier work, there's a kind of high tone of elegy, and also, I would argue, a certain quality of the oracular. When we move into the later Fenton Johnson, the tone becomes strikingly acerbic. And he's been noted for this, for there's a kind of bitterness and an irony that he allows to sit on the page in a way that's extremely striking, and was felt to be, sort of a major innovation and confrontational even in its time. So I'm going to read just a few poems from our anthology, and hopefully you'll get a sense of this evolution actually a little bit. The first one is a poem called Declaration. I love the world and all therein, the panting, darkened souls who seek a brighter light, a sweeter hope. From those who drink the bubbling wine and eat the flesh of tender fowl, I love the pampered son of wealth and pour on him my pity's oil. This world our God hath made for all, the East, the West, the black, the white, the rich, the poor, the wise, the dumb. And even beasts may share the fruit. No prison wall, but sunlight's glow. No rods of steel, but arms of love. For all that creep and walk and strive and wear upon their countenance creation's mark, the kiss of God. That's Fenton Johnson's Declaration. One of the things that I find very striking in 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 Johnson's work is his interest in, as I said, these kind of tonal shifts, but also he becomes very interested in, I would say, a kind of vignette in some sense. The idea of the poem as a kind of vignette, and one that is meant, I think, to show us, on the one hand, something like a moral problem that often shades over into a political problem in some sense. So I think for him, the moral is superior and more interesting than the political, actually, in a certain respect. But also, I think there's a kind of an interest in almost the sense of the fragment, but it's always in some sense metonymic, and he's exploring in a way, I think, this theme that has often preoccupied African-American poets, which is the relationship to community, and how to think about that relationship, how to reflect it, how to represent it, how to include it. He has a number of poems about aunts, and I want to read one called Aunt Jane Allen. And I'll just say before I read it that this is from the sort of later Fenton Johnson period, where we're almost in these kind of open prose-like lines. State Street is lonely today. Aunt Jane Allen has driven her chariot to heaven. I remember how she hobbled along, a little woman, parched of skin, brown as the leather of a satchel, and with eyes that had scanned 80 years of life. Have those who bore her dust to the last resting place buried with her the basket of aprons she went up and down State Street trying to sell? Have those who bore her dust to the last resting place buried with her the gentle word son that she gave to each of the seed of Ethiopia? I want to end with by reading what is almost certainly Johnson's most famous poem, excuse me, to the extent that he does get anthologized and remembered. It's often for this poem. That could have been, I suppose, one argument for us to leave it out, but it's too good to leave out. It's too good and it's too important. But it here, I think, in many ways, and one of the reasons it does get more anthologized is because, in some sense, it distills into a kind of concentrate. That's that much more acerbic tone that he really becomes noted for. The poem is simply called Tired. It's one word. I am tired of work. I am tired of building up somebody else's civilization. Let us take a rest, Melissa Jane. I will go down to the Last Chance Saloon, drink a gallon or two of gin, shoot a game or two of dice, and sleep the rest of the night on one of Mike's barrels. You will let the old shanty go to rot. The white people's clothes turn to dust, and the Calvary Baptist Church sink to the bottomless pit. You will spend your days forgetting you married me, and your nights hunting the warm gin Mike serves the ladies in the rear of the Last Chance Saloon. Throw the children into the river. Civilization has given us too many. It is better to die than it is to grow up and find out that you are colored. Mm-hmm. Pluck the stars out of the heavens. The stars mark our destiny. The stars marked my destiny. I am tired of civilization. Thank you.
Yes, brother. Jesse, you used to read poetry when you were at Amherst, right? And I see. I asked about you, my boy. I asked about you. It never goes away. It never goes away. Beautiful work, man. Okay. Yeah, you always circle back to it. No, it's the truth. Okay, so I feel like the bridge poet in a cool way. So the next three readers up here will read a couple of selections from the anthology and then some of our original work that we see as sort of echoes of these poems. So I'm going to start with David Wadsworth Cannon, who's a poet I love for many reasons, but one of them is that his work was not circulated during his lifetime. After he died, his mother actually gathered all of his old poems and put them together into a book entitled Black Labor Chant, and then gave her baby boy's work to the world. I don't think I fully understood what that meant until August got here, but I've just been thinking a lot about it. So this is a love poem from him. Yeah, we don't want to give too much real estate to Jefferson today, but I have been thinking though about, you know, what he said was impossible for Black people. One of them was poetry and the other thing was love, right? The Notes of the State of Virginia. So I want to begin with a love poem. Tanita, you are a forest, cool, lush, and green, and I, only a little bird, lost in the arms of your smallest tree. You are a quaint old garden in springtime, and I, only a bumblebee, caught in a spider's web, spun in your shyest flower. You are the sea at moonrise, placid, deep, and I, only a silver fish fashioning a ripple, close, close, near the heart of you. All right. Now I want to read one of the other great love poets in Minor Notes Volume 1, Angelina Weld Grimke. What can be said about Grimke? So much. A librarian, as we mentioned already. That was the librarian I was shouting out earlier. Audre Lorde was also a librarian. A lot of great librarian poets in the Black expressive tradition. I was also an eco-poet, Black queer woman, and just, you know, deeply melancholic and brave about it in a way that I appreciate and really dig. As you'll hear in the eco poems, there's always that kind of sense of sadness that is powerful, but I don't know, it never tears you asunder, you know? It's just a reminder that you're a human and you value things, right? And that's tragedy in a genre sense. We lose what we love, you know, but life is about the pursuit. All right. So this is to the Dunbar High School. Did someone in here go to Dunbar High School? Florence? You went to Dunbar High School? Okay, we gotta talk about this later. Florence Light is here. She's royalty. One of my favorite poets in the world. Master of the sonnet form and others. This is to the Dunbar High School. And she shall be the friend of youth for aye, of quickening youth whose eyes have seen the gleam, of youth between whose tears and laughter stream bright bows of hope, of youth audacious, gay, who dares to know himself a Caesar, say, a Shakespeare or a Galahad. The dream to him is real, and things are as they seem, for beauty veils him from the feet of clay. How holy and how wonderful her trust, youth's friend, and yes, how blessed. For down the west each day shall go the sun, and time shall die. The unborn shall again be dust. But she with youth eternal on her breast, a mortal too shall sit serene. Sublime. All right. Two more, and these are eco poems. Trees. been trying to write a book about trees for like 10 years. I know, Jesse remembers. I thought I was going to write my dissertation on trees at a certain point, and then now it's just a Google document. You know, it's been there forever. I'll get back to it. I got time. This is trees. God made them very beautiful, the trees. He spoke and gnarled of bole or silken sleek. They grew, majestic bowed or very meek, huge-bodied, slim, sedate and full of glees. And he had pleasure deep in all of these. And to them soft and little tongues to speak of him to us he gave, wherefore they seek from dawn to bring us to our knees. Yet here amidst the wistful sounds of leaves, a black-hued gruesome something swings and swings. Laughter it knew and joy in little things, till man's hate ended all. And so man weaves. And God, how slow, how very slow weaves he, was Christ himself not nailed to a tree. And the final one, greenness. I've been trying to write about grass too. There's a little bit of grass, I think, in one of the two poems I'm going to read from my book. This is greenness. Tell me, is there anything lovelier, anything more quieting than the green of little blades of grass and the green of little leaves? Is not each leaf a cool green hand? Is not each blade of grass a mothering green finger, hushing the heart that beats and beats and beats? All right. Now a couple of joints from my most recent book, and then I'll sit down. I introduce Danielle, who might talk some more about Phyllis Wheatley, who's kind of incredible. I've been writing a lot about Phyllis Wheatley lately. I wrote this, I teach at MIT. I wrote this policy paper recently on AI, and they didn't really control, I mean, this is on the internet, I don't care, it's fine. They didn't really even tell us it would go in the policy paper. So I just have a couple paragraphs in there about Phyllis Wheatley and like the kind of public view of her, in one sense, of her as a kind of large language model, you know, like before we had that concept, right? This idea that, oh, how could she, one, be enslaved and produce this work at all, right? If the idea is that these people were automata, right? If they were machines, if that was part of the intellectual or deeply anti-intellectual kind of architecture of enslavement, how could she have produced this work? And if she did, where does language come from? It must come from a different place than what we previously imagined. So, in so many different ways. And also, of course, June Jordan wrote so beautifully about her and the difficult miracle of Black poetry in America. That's your homework. If you haven't read that essay, go home and read that essay. The 4-month-old I mentioned earlier is named after June Jordan, our baby girl. June Sophia. June Wisdom. Okay. I'll read a poem about babies. That's fine. I guess I'll do that first. So this is dad poem number 11. The boy taps me twice on the chest, and that means go, the way it does when you're talking to a horse. The tree felled by the storm by the side of the road on our family walk, its chestnut branches posed like antennae singing silently into the charismatic sky, is also a horse. A poem is where the language of the material world collides with the divine. The poem rides the human mind like a horse. The boy sees the red station wagon outside the window and says, car, points to my watch and says, car. Aristotle says, to be a master of metaphor is the one thing that cannot be learned from others, and it is also a sign of genius. No one I know ever says their kid is a genius, aside from the boy's mother, who is the best of all worlds. Is car, in this instance, a metaphor for movement or machines? Today, I am flying to Virginia to help my uncle leave the earth. In the plan I have devised, I will show him a digital photograph. Say, this is my son, knowing the image cannot adequately reflect his splendor nor his complexity. Growing older means I am more acquainted with speechlessness than ever before. I press my hand to the tree in the backyard and say, tree. The boy is quiet, rests his head against my own. The tree says nothing I can translate without prayer. There is a place the poems cannot travel. Now I live there. All right. And this last poem, oh, thank you. So this is in part a reading about friends. Dedicate this poem to my best friend from high school, Devin, who for literally 10 years, I share a birthday with Al Roker. Does anyone know who Al Roker is? Okay, phenomenal. We have retained some things as a culture. It's beautiful. So for 10 years plus, Devin would call me every morning on my birthday, and he would say, "Happy birthday, Al Roker," which you appreciate that tenderness, I think, as you grow older. It's a weapon against loneliness and other things. So this is part of a sonic crown that opens the book. Happy birthday, Al Roker. It's how every August 20th call opens between me and Devin for a decade. Shifting only once we are old enough for mortgages, knee pain, the same blue joke about being here at all. Black men past 25, with a harrowing percentage of brothers we chased in childhood now in chains, graves, instead of here with us, on the phone, or else in some gentrified bar growing old over bourbon. I can no longer recall how the ritual was built. Something to do with my relationship to meteorology, perhaps, as it holds many things I love within its frame and feels much more like the prophecy of old than anything you see on TV these days, unless you watch the sort of shows that Grandma did before she went the way of everything too beautiful for permanence. Al Roker is a weatherman. He conveys in human speech what we cannot pull from the sky's great gray drama. The tropical storm is over his shoulder now, spinning, harmless only at this level of abstraction. I change into the raincoat that matches my favorite hat. In poems, I grow immortal. Time gathers in my hair like a silver city seen at a distance. Thank you. All right. Next to the microphone, Danielle Legros. Oh my gosh. What can I say about Danielle? Precise. Okay, so you got to understand, I've been in like a Zoom poetry workshop with Danielle for almost 3 years now. Is that right? Yeah. And it's called Langston's Legacy. We meet almost every week. Gavin Moses is also in the house chat. Can we get actually a quick round of applause for Gavin, Florence, Danielle? They just started. They started this group. I've never said this to you all. I had a really hard time when I first moved here to Boston. In part, well, Jesse wasn't here yet when I first moved out here. And I was just by myself all the time. And then it might have been Patrick, who first invited. It was you, dude. My man Patrick, always coming through for me. Who just invited me. He was like, "Hey, man, I think a couple of us are going to get together and just write poems and talk about them." And they invited me here, to Harvard's campus. And we just sat down with our printed copies of both our poems and poems we really liked. And then our group just grew and grew. And then, we included our friend Andrea, who's not here, but is being very stylish off in New York right now. She's great. And that practice of just seeing you all every week really sustained me in a real way. And I'm so thankful to you all for your diligence, the beauty of your poems. Because I'm not gonna lie, y'all are cool. If the poems weren't good, I probably wouldn't come back. Definitely not for a whole year. And Danielle in particular, as you can tell already, probably someone likes to talk a lot. Danielle always brings me back to the economy of poetry, to the concision, and to the heart of this form as the distillation of our astonishment into these little jewels we can carry around in our pockets. She's a poet that does that for so many, just like Phyllis Wheatley did. So she's the editor of Wheatley at 250, Black Women Poets Reimagine the Verse of Phyllis Wheatley Peters. And she's going to come up right now and read for you all. So please show all of your love.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you, Josh, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Josh and Jesse, for this excellent anthology and its important work of excavation and reclamation. I'm really happy to be helping you celebrate it. I'll read a few poems by Anne Spencer. Born in 1882, she was a noted activist whose home was a gathering place for Black intellectuals of her time. She was a teacher, a librarian. and a gardener, many of whose poems, the editor's note, are refracted through the lens of ecological metaphor, reminding us, also the editor's note, that environmental concerns have always been at the core of the Black expressive tradition. And I was so happy to hear the poems, the echo poems that you read earlier, Josh. So I'll begin with a short poem whose first line serves as a title. Earth, I thank you. Earth, I thank you for the pleasure of your language. You've had a hard time bringing it to me, from the ground to grunt, through the noun, to all the way, feeling, seeing, smelling, touching, awareness. I am here. God never planted a garden. God never planted a garden, but he placed a keeper there. And the keeper ever raised the ground and built a city where God cannot walk at the eve of day, nor take the morning air. He said, colon. And the poem is written within quotation marks. He said, your garden at dusk is the soul of love, blurred in its beauty and softly caressing. I, gently daring this sweetest confessing, say your garden at dusk is your soul, my love. Such a beautiful love poem. And it's a short poem too. It's rich and dense. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. This is a poem of witness, a poem of, I would argue, quiet rage. White things. Most things are colorful things. The sky, earth, and sea. Black men are most men, but the white are free. White things are rare things, so rare, so rare. They stole from out a silvered world somewhere. Finding earth plains, fair plains, save greenly grassed. They strewed white feathers of cowardice as they passed. The golden stars with lances fine, the hills all red and darkened pine. They blanched with their wand of power and turned the blood in a ruby rose to a poor white poppy flower. They pired a race of black men and burned them to ashes white. Then, laughing, a young one claimed a skull, for the skull of a black is white, not dull, but a glistening, awful thing, made, it seems, for this ghoul to swing in the face of God with all his might and swear by the hell that sired him, man maker, make white. And I'll offer up a poem of mine. Short, which explores the notion of rarity or rarity and the beauty of individuality against constructs that seek to limit and categorize and other. Only. It's my last moment. Only. Nature hides the most beautiful design, the norm, the anomaly, the rare, the rarest, which is to say, the only. And aren't we each members of twins even? Only? Including Phyllis Wheatley. Whose international dimensions I think are often underplayed. Her West African early education. She was known to, when she arrived in Boston, be scribbling on the walls in a language that folks didn't understand, or the folks around her didn't understand. Her languages, her cosmologies, which surely informed her art. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Patrick Sylvain, Professor of Global Postcolonial Literature, poet, keeper of the Haitian Creole literary tradition, photographer, and bon vivant.
Oh my God. Wow. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you to all of you. I'm going to read two poems from the book, and of course, Fenton Johnson coming back. And I'm glad you did not read the poem that I wanted to read. Actually, you read one of them. I'm like, okay, not the other one, not the other one. All right. Fenton Johnson, in a sense, has sort of given me a different kind of opening into the world, and also how Pan-Africanist he was, and not just him, Ayeta as well, Ayeta Ray. And part of my work, I'm like, you know what, I need to go back and reread him and really sit with him and to really think about what Haiti meant for Fenton Johnson in relationship to Black freedom, right? So this poem is called Jubal's Free. It's in 4 parts. Jubal's free. Sound the trumpet, honey. Jubal's free. Sound the ram horn, honey. Jubal's free. Devils goes are quaking. Mighty hell is shaking. All the stars are tumbling. Heaven's thunder rumbling. Jubal's free. 2. Dance the gospel, honey. Jubal's free. Set your feet a swinging. Jubal's free. Night has changed to morning in her breast, the warning of the God of sorrow. They must go tomorrow. Jubal's free. 3. Ring the church bells, honey. Jubal's free. Set the chimes appealing. Jubal's free. God above is shouting. Devil goes a pouting. Earth and sky is meeting. Freedom is their greeting. Jubal's free. 4. Shake the hand, my brother. Jubal's free. Sing your loudest, brother. Jubal's free. Toss your head to heaven. Living's like the living. Earth is rich with sunlight. Night is rich with moonlight. Jubal's free. And the other poet, Anyeta, was born, Ray was born in Massachusetts, was a teacher as well. And 1852, 1916, but she wrote this wonderful poem about Toussaint Louverture. right? And Haiti is burning today. Haiti is seen as the place of hell on earth today. But between 1804 to the 1860s, it was seen as the beacon, right? The place where people of color and so forth went. And as a matter of fact, most people don't know, and I seldom say this, but my ancestors are African Americans. The Sylvains came from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They moved there in 1822, right? They were between 1818 to 1856. There were over 65,000 African Americans who went to Haiti, and Haiti just gave them their freedom and, of course, citizenship. And so there are four brothers from Pennsylvania, and I wonder why the name Sylvain went to Haiti, and they stayed. And also that's partly why some of I was sort of wondering, my brothers will all have sort of English name. And that's the reason of it. But Toussaint was the figure that sort of inspired, right, the world. And Henrietta Ray wrote a poem about Toussaint Louverture. To those fair isles where crimson sunset burn, we send a backward glance to gaze on thee. Brave Toussaint, thou wast surely born to be a hero. Thy proud spirit could but spurn each outrage on thy race. Couldn't thou unlearn the lessons taught by instinct? Nay, and we share the zeal that would make all of them free. Must even with pride unto thy life work turn. Soul dignity was thine and purest aim. And how sad that thou wast left to mourn in chains beneath alien skies. On him, shame, shame. That mighty conqueror who dared to claim the right to bind thee. Him we heap with scorn, and noble patriot, God with love thy name. Yes. And of course, the shame is on Napoleon Bonaparte, right? Shame. And we're still sort of paying the price on what the French, the British, the Americans, endless conquerors. So I'll read two poems of mine for my new book. And since Danielle mentioned Haitian Creole, so perhaps I'll read one of them so that you could hear the sound. And part of the reason I write in Haitian Creole is also the same way to think about language, but also I don't like the word Creole, right? Because it is so-called not a language. I just say Haitian. And it's also to defy the fact that we could write beautiful poetry in that bastardized language, right? It's the same way that Jefferson claimed that Whitley or Black people were not capable to write in Shakespeare and Homer's language, right? And then the other thing I'll say about Whitley is that she was multilingual, right? Latin, right? Because remember, came here at the age of 8, and that's the age between 8 and 11. Before puberty, you could really acquire language very fast. But also that tells you something about how smart she was. Not only she learned English, she learned the language of poetry, she learned Latin as well, and became better at it than the so-called masters, right? She was a genius, all right? So this is why all of us are in love with Phyllis Whitley. Margin. The white of the page is the margin where silence occupies the space between the chaos of thoughts, of words, ruminating, silence. The margin is also a space where misery chokes breath into eternal silence, where the chaos of marginality muffle words into silence. Silence is hidden sight, a sight of nakedness until the margins are shoved into the main spaces, becoming cavities in neat rows of lines. The chaos of marginal space hums out a babble of hymns to the gods who have forgotten how to read marginal space and the margins of silence. What is hidden is a sight of an abandoned space where gazes flare to ogle the exuding of cavities like blotches on margins, collapsing words into silence. And I'll read it in Haitian. Mage. Espace blanche page là, c'est mage côté silence, occupé espace entre chaos, pensée et puis mots. Alimenter silence. Mage, c'est un espace tout. Côté la misère trangle souffle, dans un silence éternel. Côté chaos, espace marginal, bayonné, mot, jouk, silence tabli. Silence, c'est un regard caché, yon site toutouni, jouktan, mage, yo bousculé, nan espace principal, yo tourné, cavité, ligne, bien rangé. Chaos, espace marginal, vonvoné, sorti, nan cantique Babel, pour Dieu yo qui blié, comment pour li espace marginal yo ak mage qui prend silence. Ça qui cherche, c'est un site de un espace abandonné, côté regard yo, calé l'ouvrier, dans un dégagement, cavité, tant que tache, sous mage, yo côté, yo déconstombré, en bas silence. And the last poem, I'll only read it in English. Consumptions. This is about Haiti. Consumptions. In the cemetery of history, Haiti is animated when buried in imperial tombs. Under a constellation of tears and dust, sparkling misery like an advertisement. Bond and stock merchants capitalize on the quarried marbles that boxed her, chiseled and plastered into portals of compliance where consciousness is lacerated with visible and lasting scars. So her descendants can be born with stammering tongues, lazy eyes, and unstretched spines with voracious personalities striving on auto-consumption. Thank you.
My goodness, what a reading. Is there one more round of applause just for all the comments? And that was consumption stage. How are we on time? Should we do a quick Q&A?
Let's do a quick Q&A.
Okay. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to forward them at this moment. And I can maybe actually pass the microphone around to all of our participants. And if not, it's okay. I'll just play Jodeci off my phone or something, so we can hang out.
Can you talk a little bit about the intentional passing of the torches that happen in different generations? Because I think what comes to mind when you mentioned the tradition initially, I thought of when I moved to New York and Ross Baraka and Dina were editing the anthology in the tradition, and how much that was the project of the son and how much that anthology was curated by Amiri from a distance and by Sonia in a distance. And I was wondering if there are other instances of that happening that we can cite going all the way back to Phyllis.
Yeah. Jesse, you want me to start? I could pass this to you. Yeah, I mean, it's funny just because you brought up, Tony Medina in particular. I'm thinking about the tradition of the spoken word. I mean, I also just wrote that book for like years and in a room by myself. So I'm thinking about being 19 years old, sophomore at the University of Pennsylvania, and being on Philadelphia radio with Ursula Rucker. and doing poetry slams where Sonia Sanchez was the judge, and where Saul Williams would be like the featured poet. And really, I'm thinking about, I mean, talk about passing the torch. I mean, it was the warmth of affirmation and encouragement when no one else was around, right? It was really, for me, being a teenage poet, having these older Black poets whose work I loved, right? And didn't know deeply, right? It was just, I'd heard one or two poems and I thought, oh, that slaps. Like that really swings what you just did up there. You know, and I have a lot of books to read, but I just know the force and power of the thing really resonated with me. They just told me, oh, I really like that poem. You just did nothing too wild, right? And yo, you should do this again next year. You should read this, or you should listen to this. And with someone like Saul, I mean, he's telling you to read like Octavia Butler, you know, because his father was a minister and who would invite like folk singers to their church in Newburgh. And so for me, the passing down of that torch, sometimes it happened in academia, like it happened through the training of people like Imani Perry, for instance, when I was at Princeton with Jesse. But that was more just making sure I took time to read so that, in her words, you know, the ideas were cooked, right? Like this idea that, especially in the age of the internet, it's very easy to jump right out there with something and say, oh, hey, look at this thing I made. And it's like, be comfortable sitting in silence, reading the books around you, listening to the voices around you. So in my own personal trajectory, that was that. But I mean, we talked about Dunbar already a little bit. I mean, these were sites and institutions. Think about Motown, for instance, right? Which I'm thinking about now. I mean, Black genius is inextricable in some way historically from Black institutions, right? From these spaces like Lincoln University and Tougaloo and Howard. Jesse talked a little bit about schools of poets. We're both writing right now about the Howard poets, right? In this journal they had called Dasein, where they were all kind of reading, you know, continental philosophy and thinking about jazz and poetry together. And those were, I mean, they were reading and listening to and being taught by Sterling Brown at Howard, right? It was living, breathing Black professors who were teaching classes that these students attended to then say, all right, let me take the light from this space and carry it out into the world. So in some ways, that's the model for Minor Notes too. Like the idea is we didn't just want to put out a great book, like that was important to us, but really the sense was, I want a 16-year-old somewhere to be reading this who's never heard of Fenton Johnson, never heard of Ann Spencer, Angelina Well Grimke. I want that work to inspire their work, but I also want them to share it with somebody else and pass it on and continue to pass it on. But Jesse, I don't know if you had anything on this, or Danielle or Patrick.
I mean, I think the only thing I might add to that is, you know, that I think there is definitely an extensive role traditionally that anthologies have played. I mean, you know, James Weldon Johnson, you mentioned Barack, I mean, you know, Black Fire, that anthology, with Larry Neal, there are countless others I can think of.
Oh, yeah.
New Black Poetry. I mean, there are a number of anthologies that I think there's an interesting thing about, you know, every generation in some sense, I think has to make
Its own
anthology.
Yeah, that's right.
And you know, etymologically, it's the gathering of flowers, right? And we get to Ann Spencer in the garden, right? But it's like, in some sense, that work of cultivating yourself, right? Which is not just about maintaining a certain kind of lineage and tradition, but I think it's also, right, tempering within yourself as a poet the temptation to originality, right? Because in some sense, I think, you know, the young poet especially is always under a certain kind of pressure or temptation to sort of claim, well, you know, I'm the first who ever did it. I'm the, you know, I'm the new thing, and this is not, you know, which is a great thing, and in some sense they're always right. But at the same time, this, I think, work gains its strength from its enracination, from its rootedness, you know, from twining itself around what has come before, right? And then you're adding a twist. You're you know, you're reinventing a living garden which has to constantly change, and your agency in that role is extremely important. But I do think that, you know, it makes sense for the tradition to be shaped and to kind of have this kind of re-anthologizing function in every generation. So I do think anthologies actually are maybe an obvious but an important place to.
Yeah.
Um, or in the tradition, I think, and I'm not sure, Daniel, if you're in the anthology, and Gavin, like, so it was sort of a major anthology for members of the dark room, because we were part of the dark room, and if you look at some of the writers, right, in that anthology, John Keane, for example, just won National Book Award, and so many others. We were young, and that was like my first publication,
Wow.
right? And I remember it's like, yes, I am in mythology, right? And that sort of inspired me to continue writing, but also creating a new kind of tradition within the Haitian space because of what I've learned here, right? And in the tradition, I was mentored by Ntizaki Shenge, Yusef Komenyaka, right? And so all of these people sort of came to our living room when we were part of the dark room, and many members of the dark room, and I would argue, and that this might sound arrogant, but in a sense, when you look at what members of the dark room have accomplished in terms of price, and also we are institutional building because we are at universities and so forth, I would say we even surpass the Harlem Renaissance in a sense, right? Right. So this part of the tradition.
But what's interesting to me also is no one has actually documented this sort of string of mentorship. I think a really interesting project is you could probably follow it back.
Yeah.
All the way, at least to the beginning of the 18th century. I bet there's, I don't know, it just seems like a good challenge.
Yeah.
And I think you can actually do hand to hand.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I don't know if you guys were at Baraka's funeral, but that again was such a passing of the torch. I ended up sitting next to him on it. And, it was just, we can talk about that later, but that generational, there was a physical passing of the torch. People always say, how were you influenced by somebody? People weren't influenced, people were mentored.
That's right.
It was handed down, it was guided. We talk about inheritance and all that. That was all inherited.
And Amir Baraka was extremely generous as well. I mean, that's the other thing that we need to also think of, right? I mean, I have not sort of written about this, but Gwendolyn Brooks, for example, right? Every December, she would be sending me a card, right?
Wow.
Yeah,
I read about that. That's
right. I mean, it's in a sense, I felt lucky, right? Right place, right time, and I mean, we could even say, even with our group, Langston Legacy, I am going to talk about you, Florence Ladd, right? An amazing thinker, an amazing novelist and poet, right? And that's part of the tradition as well, right? And we feel sort of blessed, and and I think that's what sort of you guys also are doing, right? So it's just continuing the tradition. Yeah.
You got time for one more? Yeah. Please.
Or like influence the poetry itself, it did, versus writing solo. And like the mention, I think there was a mention of poetry and literature as an attempt to like address and represent community. So what that was like when actually writing in community, and then if that had anything to do with this being like a collaboration versus.
Yes, or no, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I just wouldn't have done it without Jesse, like Jesse specifically. Like, I feel like one, he's a historicist, literary critic. And I was like, nah, this brother's gonna anger this thing a certain way that I appreciate. But I feel like it had to start in friendship. I mean, so we talked a little bit about flowers, about etymology and funerals, giving people flowers when they're dead. And I think part of the project, at least for me, is about giving people their flowers while they're alive, right? Is thinking about, well, how did all of these people make me possible? And working on this anthology, I mean, you have to reach out to a lot of people. I mean, shout out to the archivists and librarians at Howard University, you know, who dug through Angelina Well-Grimke's papers to help us finish this thing, right? We were stuck. This was 2020, right? We couldn't physically go, right? So we're sending emails to folks who are sending us back scanned copies of these poems, right? We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of sheets and boxes out there in DC that people poured through lovingly, right? For two brothers they never met. Right? They just know us via email address. And we're like, we love that you're doing this. Let's contribute this, you know, for Sister Grimke. Let's make sure these poems get out in the world. That's loving labor. That means a great deal to us. So the books just don't get made, you know, without community. Shout out to our editor, Elda, Elda Roeder, who's great. Paul Slovak, my longstanding, you know, editor and mentor at Penguin, who's now retired, but has edited also like generations of Black poets, Terrence Hayes, Adrian Matika, a number of us on Penguin. You know, Paul helped bring us in, you know, to that world and help shape the books. What else? I mean, now Jesse and I, we run a community program called Minor Notes, where, as he mentioned, we bring high school students into archives to create artwork from, you know, not just this is how I feel today, but I'm looking over Wheatley's letters or James Baldwin's letters or June Jordan's report cards from when she's 15 years old. And I'm turning that into a hip hop mixtape, into a piece of choreography, into a short film. And we're really committed to this idea that archival exploration could be at the center of artistic practice, right? That maybe is part of how we make the public argument to keep these sorts of programs in schools, right? Is to say, no, like, we need to renew that. What does Raymond Williams say about tradition? It's the selection and reselection of ancestors. That needs to be an active process and practice. And I believe in these kids. You know, they're quiet, you know, they're a quiet, pensive bunch. We learned from taking them on trips. You know, someone asks you a question, they're really thinking about it, and they'll sit there for a couple of minutes so they have an answer they feel is sufficient. And in that way, I'm learning from them, right? I'm learning patience with myself, patience with the projects. So yeah, it's a community effort through and through Minor Notes, as is anything worth doing. Yeah.
Let's please give all the participants tonight another round of applause. We have some books for sale. The participants will be signing books. If everyone could please move your chairs up against one of the walls, I'd be grateful. Thank you so much for attending tonight's event.
Woo! Great job, James.
Thank you.
You crushed it, man.
Fabulous.
I never see you beat, man. Rock that shit. He brought me back. I said, wait a minute. Wait a minute.
Okay.
Oh, so translatable. It's not like I was thinking about because I was looking at that's so fire. It's like so something. It's like it's without an end, right?